The start of the new series, if you remember from last week, talked about the doing another Bible character and talking about Joseph. And most people know a great deal about Joseph. One reason why I've never done one is because of the knowledge that people have. Also because of the volume of information, more written about Joseph in Genesis than Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as well as Abel, Adam, Noah, so on. A lot of knowledge. You also have a lot of people have already made up their minds too. They have certain things they like to talk about. Also, the purpose then for doing it was to, according to 1 Corinthians, to chapter 10, it tells us an example. Romans 15 and verse 4 says we do it for our instruction, so that through perseverance we might be encouraged and bring about hope. So one of the reasons we're doing it, obviously the key verse for Joseph is Genesis 50 and verse 20, and you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. And so I think it's important to recognize it, that you have that. Last week, if you remember, we saw the dysfunctional family that he grew up in, and I think dysfunctional is is the norm, really. And we saw that in deception. We obviously started all the way back with Abraham, but the deception was there, whether it be with Isaac, and you saw it with Jacob, and you saw it with Rebekah. Laban obviously did it. Rachel did it with the idols. If you remember, his brothers did it at Shechem. You also then had the dysfunctional roles. You remember, he obviously Jacob didn't fulfill his role at times as he should have. You had dissatisfaction. Whenever Rachel couldn't have children, what did she do? She gave her maid to him. When Leah couldn't have children, she gave her maid to him. It was dissatisfaction. A lot going on. Even when Rachel did have a child, then she was naming Joseph, and she's wanting another one, remember? So I think quite often dissatisfaction is there, but we also then saw discipline was a problem. He didn't discipline when Diana was raped. He didn't take care of the problem, and then his two sons, Simeon and Levi, didn't discipline. Didn't discipline Reuben when he then had relations with his Rachel's maid. And so I think you can see the discipline was a problem. And then obviously God was still at work. So we saw that last week. And today, what I'd like to look at, I think so often when we look at different things, what we fail to recognize, I think at times, is that we only look at one part, and we need to realize, how many of you remember the saying that used to go out and people even had little buttons? Please be patient with me, God isn't what? Not finished with me yet. I think it's important for us to look at that when you look at Joseph, but obviously Joseph grew up in the family, so we're looking at Jacob and the family to realize where they're at. Because we quite often emphasize one part of the family, but we don't look at all of it. So we're thinking about that. I remember had a customer who came up to me a number of years ago and said that at her church they were studying David. And she was appalled, how could David possibly be a man after God's own heart? Because they were only looking at one part, the problems and the sins that he committed. But according to the book of Acts, to be a man after God's own heart, you have to be obedient, and he certainly was obedient on so many things. And so I think it's important we can easily dissect or look at one part of their life. So I want us to think about it. If you remember, we also defined great, or I said we would look at it. If you remember great from last week, Phil Jackson, the basketball coach, said great is when a player goes from the concept of me to we. The only problem with that is that only works on the basketball court, but that can be we on the court and me on outside the court. I think it's better to say to be great is to go from me to thee. And I think that is when you go from being just a normal person, it's an average person, to a great person, when you care about what he thinks and everything's about him. So let's look at it a little bit about it then. We'll do a little bit about it. I saw two comics were given to me this past week and kind of related to this subject. Remember I said Joseph is a man of integrity, and he's also a man of forgiveness. If any of you read Garfield from a couple of weeks ago, Garfield, I don't know who his girlfriend is, but he's talking to his girlfriend, and she said, I admire a man with integrity. And he says, I have a lot of integrity. She said, you do? Yes, I stole it. Sounds like a lot of integrity, doesn't it? A little further down on the page, it then talked about Pickles. You know, Pickles is the grandmother and the grandfather, and Nelson's the little grandson. And the grandfather talks to Nelson and says, "I'm a great role model for you." And he then asks his wife, the grandmother, "Don't you think I'm a great role model?" And she says, "Yeah, I think you are a great role model. You know, there's two types of role models. There's one good one to follow and one not to follow. And you've been a good example of what not to do." So I think we can look at a lot of this too. We can learn a lot from Joseph's family of what to do and what not to do. So let's look at it. If you remember, part of it is being reviewed because we wanted to get into Joseph mostly next week. But first thing is deteriorating family. It's deteriorating from where he was at, and his house keeps going down. Deteriorating family, if you remember we saw last week, remember he started off with one wife, then he had 2 wives, then he had 3 wives, then he had 4 wives, 29 and 30. Because each time one of them couldn't give children, they didn't give them maid. Deteriorating family, how do you think that would work in the family relationship? How do you want to share it? Deteriorating family. Same thing with wages in Genesis 31. How many times in 20 years' time, how many times did Laban change his wages? According to the text, it changed him how many times? You remember? 10 times. You'll find that they each were trying to change to gyp the other one, and that Jacob was trying to, he used selective breeding, and he would breed the strong to his strong, and then the weak he'd breed for Laban, and each one was trying to basically get the best of the other one. Deteriorating family. Obviously deteriorating too with Diana in chapter 34 when it talks about when she was raped by in Shechem, and then what do the brothers do? Dad does nothing because he's fearful of retaliation by the people. So his brothers then take it over and they deceive him and they then kill him. A deteriorating family. Reuben, obviously, in chapter 35, the next chapter, he does the same thing with his, talking about the maid. And again, Dad doesn't know anything about it. In chapter 37, we can look at that one for a moment. These are kind of deteriorating family. 37, you'll notice Joseph is sent out to where his brothers, he's 17 years of age, and at the end of verse 2 of chapter 37, Joseph brings back a bad report about them to their father. God obviously wants to know, and so he's honest, he tells them. How well do you think that works out in the relationship of the family? He did what he should have done, but you'll notice also then he relates in verse 4, his brothers see that his dad loves him more, and they hate him and couldn't speak to him on friendly terms. He then has a dream in 5, and he tells his brothers about it, and it said they hated him what? Even more. In verse 8, he tells them another dream, and his brothers say they hated him what? Even more. I mean, we're going from hate, I hate him more, I hate him more. It's really getting bad. And then notice in 11, his brothers were jealous of him. So would you agree that the family is deteriorating? It's going from bad to worse to worse to worse. Notice then, I think about it in our own family, whether it be a church family or a personal family or whatever you're at. Am I contributing to the deterioration, or am I also helping to correct it? That's a question we can ask ourselves. Am I helping to contribute to it? Church, nation, would you agree our nation is deteriorating? Okay, but what are we doing? Are we helping to contribute to the deterioration of it, or are we helping to correct it? So you think about it, something to be asking ourselves. So obviously, first of all, it's a deteriorating family, but at the same token, it's also a developing family. And so part of it depends on how you want to look at what parts of their life. Just give you some of the ways you can see that God and how they're developing. If you remember, right in the middle with the 4 women, who named the children? Do you know? Of all 12 sons, who named them? Only 2 named them all. And who were they? Leah, she named all of her children and all of her maid's children. And Rachel named all of them. But when you look at the names, each one was attributing it to something to do with God. Do we ever stop? And in the middle of it, remember, they came with Laban and with his gods. They are developing and they are seeing things. And so even in the midst of it, God is still at work and there is things happening in their life that we need to keep in mind. You go a little bit later, if you remember in chapter 31 of Genesis, it says when he changed his wages 10 times, he also talked about when Jacob was talking to Laban when they were leaving. He also makes an interesting deal, and he says he stayed out all day and all day. He's working all the time. I may be reading more into it, but so who's raising the kids if he's working all the time?
Mothers.
The mothers. Who also comes from the background of who has Isaac as his father, Abraham as his grandfather, who had the spiritual heritage. And who has the spiritual heritage when you think about it with the mothers. It's interesting when you think about it, that he has it. And you get to when he wrestles with wrestle with pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, and he then never has the limp. The next time you find him in the fields, is he with them, or is just the sons doing the shepherding? You no longer find him in the fields. Is it because he had the limp the rest of his life and he couldn't do it? Don't know, we're never told. But his sons are in it. But I think the reason why the point is, was he all working so much of the time? Remember, he was there even for all the breeding, doing everything, trying to make his herd great when God had already promised him those things. Was he trying to do everything and not allow God to do his part? And he's then developing and he tries to do it all on his own, but at the end he's doing more and more, and he's obviously recognizing God working in his life and doing things. Which part of his life do we emphasize not recognizing God's work? You can see it later on when he meets Esau. When he meets Esau, the night before he splits them up into parties. Remember the story? And what does he do with the ladies? He breaks them up into groups, and he first sends the maids and their children. He then sends Leah, and then he sends Rachel with Joseph. And where's Jacob? At the very back. But when he meets Esau, where is he?
In the front.
What caused him to go from the back to the front?
His encounter with God.
His encounter with God. Instead of doing things in his own way, he now is where he should be. He's at the front. The reason he's putting everything up front is he thought if he kills one, kills them, he's thinking of himself and self-preservation. He's doing what's right. But how many times do we ever recognize the development that's taking place in his life? You have the same thing happened in chapter 35, which we haven't looked at. Look over in chapter 35. He's about to go into the land. In chapter 35, where he met God when he first came out at Bethel, and he's now going back. And notice what happens in verse 2. So Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, "Put away the foreign gods which are among you, purify yourself and change your garments." Okay? Did Rachel have her idols that she's been carrying the whole time? When he gets to the land, he's now saying what? Every one of you, get rid of every one of your idols. Why did he allow them to have it all the way up till now? Notice again, there's a development that's taking place in Jacob's life. And so I think it's important for us to recognize when we look at every person, we can look at different parts of our family and we can say it's dysfunctional. We can say it's falling apart. But God could still be developing us, developing the people. And we need to recognize it when we look at it. So again, I think about it. When people look at our lives, would they say, "Are you developing as a Christian?" You can see it in Jacob's life if we're being fair and honest. What evidence is there to say that I'm developing? You know, am I trying to help my family? By the way, how do we know all these stories about Jacob? How many, when he had these encounters with the angels and the dreams, who would know about it? So does that mean he's relating it to his family and his family's relating it down? How important is that for Joseph later in his life with the dreams and everything else about recognizing what his father had told him what happened in his life? Let's think about it. We had this, when you think about it, you have the two things so far. You have the deteriorating family, and then you had the developing family. But I want us to think about, for the most part, the divine assistance that takes place. So let's look at some of them. We'll go to chapter 28 of Genesis, and we'll look at a few of these. In chapter 28, you remember, he tries to do everything on his own, talking about Jacob. You remember his mother deceived father, right, with the birthright, and he never saw his mother again. And remember the kind of what he was doing the whole time with that of deception. But in chapter 28, you notice in verse 12, when he's leaving the land, how old would he be? Remember, he's going off to get a wife, right? Leaving the land. What does he have with him? Doesn't have anything. So notice now, when you think about it, in verse 12, it'd be a little bit scary, wouldn't it? Basically, you're running away from home, afraid your brother's going to kill you, and you're going to go looking for a wife, and you're going to go to a place that you've never been before. So notice in verse 12, and he had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set earth, with its top reaching heaven, and behold, what were ascending and descending? Angels of God. It's important because you're going to see that later again. You'll notice they see that on. Notice in verse 13, and behold, the Lord stood above and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the land in which you lie, I'll give it to you and to your descendants. Okay, if that's the case, is he going to get married? Is he going to have kids? Is Esau going to kill him? Okay, notice when he's leaving, God gives him this promise. Now he's going to try to manipulate all kinds of stuff. It's developing. Am I going to do it my way, or am I going to let God do it? It starts off with him. Notice he says in 14, it'll be like the descendants will be like the sands of the sea, just like was promised to his father and to his grandfather. Notice in 15, and behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done all that I promised you. Okay? How assuring would that be? You know, up to this point, he hadn't done very many things right, had he? Deceiving, heel grabber, so on. And you'll notice then in verse 20, it's interesting, he names the place Bethel, but notice in verse 20, which is important, but notice in verse 20, and Jacob made a vow, saying, notice, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then what? The Lord will be my God. How many years later was this? 20 years. So notice then, God's made him a promise. You'll be my God if all these things happen. In this 20 years now, he's going to do everything on his own, basically. Back and forth. He tries to, with the selective breeding and does all the stuff. He does it on his own. Notice then, so did God help him in finding a bride? Okay. Notice the next one in chapter 31 that you find it. Chapter 31. If you remember in 31, he and Laban are going back and forth, and he does the changing the wages, and he does different things, and he wants to leave Laban. And so he does it deceivingly, because he's afraid Laban's going to take his wives away from him and he's going to take his livestock. He tries to do things on his own. Did God promise he would come back? Did God promise he'd have descendants? So is he going to believe God's promise, or is he going to do it on his own? So notice then he does it, and Laban's coming after him. And notice what happens then in chapter 31. And notice in verse 26. Laban said to Jacob, why have you done by deceiving me and carrying away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and deceive me, and did not tell me, so that I might send them away with joy, with songs, with timbrels, and with lyre? You did not allow me to kiss my sons, my daughters. Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do to you harm. But notice 29. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to speak either good or bad. Laban's coming after him. He's going to get his stuff back. Just what Jacob knows Laban. Tries to do things in his own way. But who has to come and say, no, these things aren't because of you, they're because of who? They're because of me, and I'm the one who's going to protect you. And notice then, Laban doesn't do it because he knows that God told him not to. God's protecting. Brought him a family, brought him a wife, gave him these things, and he's allowing him to keep them because he promised him. He does this. It's interesting. Notice in verse 42. Now that Jacob speaking, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, had not been with me, surely for now would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands, and so he rendered judgment last night. That's a good statement for him to make. He recognizes everything he has comes from who? Comes from God. Yes, he worked hard and he toiled, but notice he recognizes what I have is because of God, because he could have been taken from me anytime. Divine assistance. Notice that leaving. Notice then you get into chapter 32. Remember, he knows he's going back to the land. And when he left the land, why did he run away? Get away from Esau. He's going back, and Esau is going to kill him, remember? And when people are vengeful and they're not following the Lord, they will cut off, and do they remember a grudge? I'll never forget working with an individual. Something happened 20 years earlier at the refinery, and he was still trying to get even. Still trying to get even. So notice then, he's scared to death of Esau. He knows his brother. And so notice what happens in 32, first part of it. Notice in verse 1. Now, as Jacob went on his way, who met him? Angels of God. When he left to go to get a bride, who did he see going up and down? The angels, right? He saw the angels going up and down. Now that he comes back, who does he see? He sees the angels. Again, how important is it to recognize God's in control? God was in control when we went, and now that I'm coming back, I got to keep in mind who's in control. And what happens is the hardest part, because Jacob always wants to do things on his own. That's his tendency. He's deceiving. It's been in his family the whole time. And so that's why I notice he then starts to do all these different things of splitting them up, and he wants to come up with this big gift and try to appease his brother and do all these things. So here he's doing it. He's going to meet his brother, and God says, I'm going to be with you. And then notice in chapter 32, and you get down to verse 9. Jacob is speaking, he's in prayer. Jacob says, O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, O the Lord who did say to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. Okay, so God directed him to go, and he's reminding him of the promise. Should you and I remind us of God's promises to us? Shows faith. Notice, I am worthy of all thy loving kindness and of all thy faithfulness which thou hast shown to thy servant. With my staff only I crossed the Jordan, and I have become two companies. He recognizes everything he has came because of who? Because of God. Just like he promised. Then notice his petition. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother with the children. He makes an honest request. But again, it's good for him to be praying, but did God already not say he would? But he prays. And notice his pledge. He reminds God of the pledge in 12. For thou didst say, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Okay? He's honest. He's praying. He's making a petition. He's about to meet Esau. God's already shown him the angels will be with him. And notice then he then breaks them up into parties. He's going to give these great wealth to Esau. He starts doing that in 13 down. And he sends them across, and he stays on the other side. He has them in different parties. In case Esau comes, he's going to meet him. And then what does he do all night? In verse 22 down to verse 32, what does Jacob do all in? He prays. And I think it's important. He's wrestling with God in prayer. And so obviously, God could have done anything to him at any time because he's greater. I want you to realize this was written about again in Hosea. Have you ever read Hosea 12 and verse 4? Let's look at it, because this is the commentary that you had of what took place that night. Look over in Hosea chapter 12, and notice in verse 3 and 4, talking about Jacob. Remember, he is developing God's assistance. Notice what it says in chapter 12 in verse 3 and 4. In the womb he took hold of his brother by the heel. Remember, he's called heel grabber, that's where his name comes from. In his maturity, he did what? He contended with God. Big difference, lady. Notice in verse 4, yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He found him at Bethel. He prays all night, asking for God's what? For God's help and God's protection. He does his part and tries to manipulate things, but ultimately he recognizes he needs God. He needs God's help to protect him. How many times do you and I try to do everything on our own? We try to do a lot of different things. And how well does it work? Petitions God all night, doesn't it? But God sees it and God intercedes. And it's interesting when he goes to meeting in chapter 33, then back in Genesis, he does split them up. And he has the same thing, talking about the maids first, and then Leah, and then Rachel, and so on. But notice he puts them there and the children. But notice in verse 3, Jacob himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. You notice he switches after he's spent all night with God, and he's in the front. You recognize it. But I want you to think about it. Notice then Esau, notice how the difference is in verse 4. Esau ran up to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. 20 years, Jacob's been dreading this confrontation because he thought he was going to kill him. Who's been working on Esau? There was not one thing Jacob did to change Esau's heart. Who changed his heart? How many times are you and I trying to try to do God's job? There's only one person who's going to change Esau or anybody else in our family, and that's God. Our job is to pray, but God does the changing. But you notice Jacob is constantly trying to manipulate things, and he's trying to do God's job, and he has to learn. But how many times do we look at that and we think of Jacob? We just think of the bad things. His learning process, he's learning in his life. But how many of us are Jacobs in our life and we try to do things on our own, and we need to recognize we need to see God and what God's doing in our life and what God does in somebody else's life. How many of you ever tried to play God in somebody else's life? And how well does it work? It's amazing how that, when you look at it. Notice in chapter 35, in verse 5, you see it again. If you remember in chapter 35 and verse 5, this is when they're in the land. You remember he doesn't punish the men of Shechem and his sons go and do it. And he then gets on to his sons because he's afraid that the surrounding cities now are going to attack him. And after he's given up his idols, or had them give up their idols, notice in verse 5 of chapter 35. And as they journeyed, there was a great fear upon the cities which were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Who put the fear in it? God did. He needed to what? Rely on God. He's trying to do everything on his own. He doesn't punish. He doesn't do things. He's fearful of what people are doing, or what they will do, or whatever, instead of doing what God, and let God do his job. And God already said he was going to protect them. He already said he'd bring them back. I already said that they were going to have this. We need to rely on God's promises and do our part and let God do his part. Let's think about just some applications. When you think about it, I think some of the ones you have is, am I trying to solve all the issues in my own life on my own? Am I seeking God's assistance? And do I recognize and accept His assistance? There's a lot of assistance that was going on, but Jacob tried to do it. And that's why I said there's development in his life. Another one, do I trust God's promises or do I try to solve it on my own? Am I developing as a Christian, and can other people see it? How many people can see the change in my life that's taking place? They should. So even notice in the middle, it was a deteriorating family, but it was a developing family. But they're also dying divine assistance too. And all of it can be going on at the exact same time. And what do we want to dwell on? What we don't have, or what's going wrong, or recognizing what God is doing? So think about it. Recognize what God's doing and then give Him the credit and work with His plan. And work with His plan. And work with His plan. And work with His plan.